Have you ever changed someone's life just by lending your phone? What if that someone turned out to be one of the most powerful women in the country? And what if she called you back with an offer that could rewrite your future? This isn't a story about luck. It's about timing, quiet kindness, and the kind of choice most people scroll past. In the next few minutes, you'll follow the journey of a broke college student who gave his last 1% of battery to a stranger in heels and found himself at the center of something far bigger than he could imagine. His name is Brian. He had 3 part-time jobs, a cracked phone, and a mother waiting at the other end of every paycheck. He didn't know who she was. He didn't ask. He just said yes. And that one quiet yes, it changed everything. Let me take you back to where it all began. A freezing night, a dim bus stop, and a moment that would echo across years. The wind cut through his jacket like it had something personal against him. Brian hunched his shoulders, pulling the thin fabric tighter as he waited at the cracked bus stop. It had been another 10-hour shift at the diner, clearing tables, wiping counters, pretending tips were enough to matter. All he wanted was to get home, microwave leftover noodles, and collapse on the lumpy mattress that doubled as both his bed and his couch. His phone buzzed weakly, 1% battery. Not enough to call his mom, just enough to check the time. It was late. Then he saw her. She came out of nowhere, heels clicking, breath visible in the cold. Coat far too elegant for the neighborhood. Her eyes were wide, frantic. She looked like someone who didn't belong here, and knew it. "Excuse me," she said, voice tight but composed. "I'm sorry to bother you, but my phone was just stolen. I need to call my driver. It's urgent. Could I borrow your phone? Just for one call." Brian blinked. He was exhausted and skeptical. People didn't usually run up to broke students in sketchy neighborhoods unless they wanted something more than kindness. And he had every reason to say no. His phone was old. His world depended on it staying alive even just a little longer. But something in her eyes, an urgency that wasn't performative, a kind of controlled panic, made him hesitate. She wasn't begging. She was trusting him. So, despite the cold, despite the risk, despite the dying battery, he unlocked the screen, handed it over, and simply said, "Go ahead." Sometimes kindness isn't loud. It doesn't come with hashtags or applause. It's just a quiet decision, made when no one is watching, from someone who has almost nothing left to give. And the truth is, most people wouldn't have done what Brian did. Not because they're bad, but because they're tired, guarded, distrusting. In a world that teaches us to protect what little we have, giving something away, especially to a stranger, feels foolish. But that's the very thing that made his choice powerful. Because the thing about defining moments is, you never know it is one until much later. And this moment, it was about to change everything. Next, we'll step inside her world, the woman behind the heels and the urgency, and what she saw in Brian that would pull him into a future he never saw coming. Clara Whitmore was used to being invisible in plain sight, not because people ignored her, but because they only saw the surface. The tailored coat, the luxury car, the air of someone who always knew where she was going. But that night, under the dim light of a forgotten bus stop, she didn't feel powerful. She felt vulnerable, cold, and honestly a little afraid. Her phone had been stolen blocks away near a construction site. Her driver was waiting somewhere she couldn't reach. And now, here she was, asking a stranger, a tired college student in a frayed hoodie, to trust her with the only lifeline he had left, his phone. She didn't expect him to say yes, not because he looked unkind, but because she remembered what it was like to have very little and how tightly you learn to hold on to anything that works. But he said yes anyway. That moment, fleeting as it was, hit her harder than she let on. Clara returned the phone, thanked him, and turned toward the sleek black car that had just pulled up. But before she stepped in, she looked back. The backpack, the paper sticking out from his coat pocket, the way his eyes didn't ask for anything in return. He never asked who she was. Not once. And for someone like Clara, that was rare, because she was Clara Whitmore, founder of Whitmore Impact Ventures, early investor in 3 of the top social startups in America. A woman who had once made front-page news simply for choosing to stay out of it. She was media-shy, calculated, and had built her empire not on luck, but survival. But Brian didn't care about any of that. He didn't ask for her business card. He didn't try to take a photo. He didn't pitch her a dream. He just gave, quietly, freely, and in a world where most people only give when there's something to gain. That made him unforgettable. Sometimes, the most powerful people don't need help. They need to be reminded what trust looks like. And in that moment, Clara didn't see a struggling student. She saw something she hadn't seen in a very long time. Sincerity without expectation. It stayed with her all the way home. Past the doorman who greeted her by name. Past the penthouse elevator that knew her fingerprint. Even as she sat in her apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows and no one to share the view with, she kept thinking about the boy at the bus stop who just said yes. She could have moved on. But something, a whisper of memory, maybe a crack in the armor, held her still. Because once upon a time, she was him. Only no one had stopped for her. And so, she made a call, not to driver, not to security, but to someone who reminded her of who she used to be. Brian didn't talk much about his life. Not because he had anything to hide, but because he'd learned early that most people only listen when you have something shiny to say. And his life, it wasn't shiny. It was early mornings before the sun rose. It was calloused hands from carrying trays, swollen feet from standing too long. It was textbooks scribbled with notes between espresso stains and late-night security shifts. And it was phone calls to his mother, made from the quietest corner of his shared apartment, just to let her hear his voice and know he was okay. He carried more than a backpack. He carried worry. Rent that crept up every semester. Scholarship letters that came back with polite rejections. A refrigerator that hummed louder than it cooled. A radiator that knocked like it was protesting winter itself. He carried guilt. His mother's arthritis had worsened, and she could no longer sew like she used to. Her income disappeared. So Brian sent what little he made, cutting corners, skipping meals, wearing shoes with soles worn thin. He carried hope. A crumpled sheet of paper in his pocket listed part-time job leads and tutoring hours. A biology degree that might open a door. A belief, though it dimmed some days, that if he just kept going, something good might come. And through it all, he never complained. Not when customers ignored his smile. Not when professors forgot his name. Not even when he was told, once again, that his application lacked the exceptional profile they were looking for. He just kept moving. Quietly, patiently, with the kind of dignity that doesn't make headlines, but builds character the world desperately needs. And maybe that's why his yes mattered so much. Because it didn't come from abundance. It came from empathy. It came from someone who knew what it meant to be overlooked and still chose to see someone else. That night, Clara saw the outside. But it was what she would discover next. The story behind Brian's worn-out shoes and quiet strength that would stay with her long after. It had been a long day. Brian sat on a cold stone bench near the science building, his shoulders heavy, his body tired in that deep, bone-level way only exhaustion understands. The campus was quiet, the kind of silence that feels like it belongs to someone else. He pulled out his phone, cracked, flickering, barely hanging on, 5% battery left. He wasn't checking social media. He wasn't texting anyone. He was just sitting, letting the weight of another no settle in. Earlier that day, he had received another rejection email, regretfully declined. It wasn't the first. It wouldn't be the last. But this one hurt more, maybe because he had really believed this time. Believed that maybe, just maybe, someone would look past his lack of headlines and see the human being behind the struggle. And then it buzzed. A number he didn't recognize lit up the screen. He almost let it go to voicemail, probably a robocall or worse, a scam. But something told him to answer. Hello. There was a brief pause, then a calm, unmistakable voice. Brian, this is Clara Whitmore. He froze. For a moment, he thought he misheard. But it was her, Clara Whitmore, the woman from the bus stop, the one who had disappeared into a black car and out of his life, now calling him directly I hope this isn't a bad time, she said gently. I've been meaning to reach out since that night, but I want to be sure I had the right number. Brian didn't know what to say. What was the right thing to say when someone like her calls someone like you? So he said the only thing that felt honest. I wasn't expecting this. She chuckled softly, a sound that surprised even her. I understand, but I meant it when I said you left an impression. And I believe when someone makes you stop and think, you don't ignore that. That moment right there was the hinge, the small, quiet turning point that would eventually swing open a door to something far greater. Not because Clara offered him money, not because she was famous, but because she saw him and chose not to walk away. Sometimes the moment that changes your life doesn't feel grand. It's not a spotlight or a standing ovation. Sometimes it's just a calm voice in the dark saying, I remember you and I want to talk. She ended the call with a promise. My driver will pick you up tomorrow. We'll talk then. And just like that, the line went silent. But inside Brian, something stirred. Not certainty, not relief, but hope. Small, shaky, but very much alive. The next morning, Brian stood on the curb, backpack over one shoulder, heart pounding in his chest, as a sleek black car pulled up again. This time, he wasn't handing over a phone. He was walking into something he never expected. The car was silent inside, like a moving meditation. Brian sat stiffly in the back seat, his fingers tightening around the frayed strap of his backpack. The leather interior smelled like pine and something expensive he couldn't name. The city passed him by, skyscrapers he'd never walked past, neighborhoods that seemed plucked from magazines. And then the car slowed, turning into the underground garage of a towering glass building that shimmered like it didn't belong to the same world as student cafeterias and part-time job boards. An elevator carried him to the top floor, just him, no buttons to press. When the doors opened, it felt like stepping into a different life. The office was vast, minimalist, and quiet. Floor-to-ceiling windows, spilled golden morning light across a long desk. And in front of that light stood Clara Whitmore. She turned as he stepped in. Brian, she said, with a warmth that caught him off guard. Thank you for coming. He nodded, still unsure if he was supposed to sit or stand, speak or stay quiet. She motioned to the seat across from her. On the desk in front of him was a folder. Neat, precise, waiting. I owe you some truth, she said, folding her hands. You helped me that night without knowing who I was. So now let me tell you. She leaned in slightly. I'm the founder and CEO of Whitmore Impact Ventures. We fund education, sustainability, healthcare, but more importantly, we invest in people. Quiet leaders, invisible change makers. People like you. She opened the folder and slid it toward him. Inside, a scholarship offer. Full tuition, housing, books, living stipend, everything. Brian stared at it, like it might vanish if he blinked too hard. I asked my team to learn a bit more about you, Clara continued gently. Not to invade your privacy, just enough to understand the kind of person who gives without asking anything in return. He flushed. You looked into me? I did, she said plainly. And I found someone who reminds me of who I used to be. She paused, not for drama, but for memory. I was raised in a trailer park. Lost my parents in a fire when I was 16. Survived, hustled, built something from nothing. But somewhere along the way, I forgot how powerful one simple act of kindness can be. She looked at him, not through him. That night, you reminded me. Brian's voice was barely above a whisper. I don't know what to say. You don't need to say anything, Clara smiled. But I'm offering you this, no strings. You won't owe me a cent. Just keep being who you are. And then, as if that wasn't enough, she added, I'd also like to invite you into something more. She described leading with kindness, a retreat and leadership initiative she'd started. 3 months. Mentors from across industries. A place not to impress, but to grow. Not perform, but to reflect. If you do well, she said, there's a chance for a permanent role with us. Brian looked down at the offer again, then back at Clara. Her face wasn't pitying. It wasn't patronizing. It was recognizing, like she saw in him something he hadn't even dared to claim for himself. "I don't know if I deserve this," he said honestly. "You do," she replied. "You earned it the moment you handed me that phone." Sometimes, what changes your life isn't the opportunity. It's having someone believe you're worth offering it to in the first place. The next morning, Brian packed the only bag he had, 2 shirts, a journal, and borrowed courage, and headed toward a retreat he never knew existed, to stand among voices louder and resumes longer, carrying with him nothing but who he really was. The retreat was nestled in the hills, quiet, sunlit, and impossibly serene. To Brian, it felt like another planet. No honking cars, no microwave beeping, no shift schedules taped to a corkboard, just space, stillness, and people he never thought he'd sit beside. There were 20 of them, students from Ivy League schools, young entrepreneurs who had already launched startups, activists who'd been published in national journals. Some had TEDx talks. Some had LinkedIn followings the size of a small town. And then there was Brian. Secondhand sneakers, 1 backpack, a biology major who poured coffee and cleaned stairwells between lectures. He introduced himself simply. "Hi, I'm Brian. I work part-time and study biology. I'm here to learn." No fanfare, no polished pitch, just the truth. Nobody laughed, but he could feel the pause, that quiet curiosity that wondered. How did he get in? At first, Brian mostly listened. He nodded along during ethics debates, took notes during workshops on systemic change, sat quietly during heated conversations about leadership and innovation. But then something happened. During a group project, tension flared. 2 dominant voices clashed. Ideas, egos, theories. The team fractured. People stopped listening and started defending. Brian didn't raise his voice. He didn't quote a study or cite a best-selling author. Instead, he asked each person to take a walk with him, one by one, not to debate, just to talk. He listened, really listened, and when the group came back together, he reminded them gently, "We're not here to be right. We're here to do what's good." That one sentence shifted the room. Their team ended up delivering one of the most thoughtful, unified presentations of the week. Brian didn't lead with charisma. He led with presence. He noticed when someone skipped breakfast and quietly left a granola bar on their notebook. He stayed after workshops to help rearrange chairs. He didn't speak often, but when he did, people leaned in. There's a kind of leadership no school teaches. It doesn't show up on resumes. It doesn't win applause. But it stays with people because it makes them feel safe, seen, and valued. Brian didn't know it yet, but while he was quietly building trust, others were starting to follow. And then one afternoon, that quiet leadership would be tested when someone else needed help, and Brian would have to choose again. Halfway through the program, each participant received a modest stipend, just enough to cover essentials. Gas, groceries, a phone bill. For most, it was a footnote. For Brian, it was a lifeline. He had been rationing, stretching, waiting for this exact deposit, so he could send his mom a little extra. Not much, but enough to help with winter heating and overdue medication. He had already written the envelope, already planned the call. But that afternoon, he walked into the room and saw his roommate, Matteo, packing. "Where you going?" Brian asked. Matteo looked up, eyes red, jaw clenched. "My brother was in an accident," he said. "Back home. I need to be there." Then quieter, "But I can't afford the ticket. And I can't ask my family. They're already drowning in hospital bills." Brian didn't speak right away. He just stood there, heart thudding, the envelope heavy in his back pocket. He could have said, "I'm sorry." He could have nodded and left. He could have waited, hoped someone else stepped in. But he didn't. Instead, he walked into his room, pulled out the envelope he had just sealed, and handed it to Matteo. "Take it," he said. Matteo froze. "No, Brian, this is yours. You need it." Brian shook his head. "Not today." And that was that. No speech. No Instagram post. Just a quiet decision that would ripple far beyond the moment. Matteo hugged him, speechless. Clara found out later. not through Brian, but through the retreat coordinator. She didn't need to ask who it was. She already knew. That's the kind of leadership no one teaches. Not the kind that stands at podiums. Not the kind that posts mission statements or holds microphones. It's the kind that notices. The kind that steps in when the cameras aren't rolling. The kind that gives, not from excess, but from sacrifice. Clara watched Brian differently after that, from a quiet distance. She saw how others gravitated toward him, not for strategy, but for sincerity. He didn't dominate group discussions. He didn't try to impress anyone. But he was the one people went to when things got hard, when someone fell out of place, when a decision needed to be made that required heart, not just logic, leadership without ego, presence without noise. And slowly, Clara began to feel something she hadn't felt in years. Trust, not just in Brian, but in people, in possibility, in the belief that maybe, just maybe, the world could change, one quiet decision at a time. And so, when Clara planned a trip to a small, struggling town she once called home, she didn't want cameras or consultants. She wanted Brian. Clara didn't make announcements. When she traveled, it was quiet, intentional. And this trip to Ridgewell, a dusty, half-forgotten town hidden between long stretches of farmland, was no different. She asked Brian the night before. Just the two of them standing near the retreat center's garden lights. "I'm heading out to Ridgewell tomorrow," she said. "We're funding a clean water project there. It's a place I used to know well. Would you like to come with me?" Brian blinked, unsure if she was serious. "You want me to come?" She smiled softly. "Yes, you." The next morning, they boarded a small foundation plane. It hummed low over the hills and forests, carrying them towards something neither of them could name yet. Ridgewell wasn't much to look at from air. Scattered rooftops, parched fields, a single main street where time seemed to have stopped somewhere around 1992. But when they landed, the welcome was warm. Clara stepped out like someone returning to a childhood home. No fanfare, just familiarity. People hugged her. She listened, really listened. No clipboard, no assistant with a checklist. Just her, asking questions no one else ever bothered to ask. And Brian saw something different in her there. She wasn't the polished CEO, not the headline-making investor. She was just a woman who remembered where she came from and who still carried parts of it quietly, like an old song you hum when no one's around. That evening, they sat on a tin-roof porch, sipping sweet tea with a local family. The sky stretched wide and orange. Kids laughed barefoot in the dust, and somewhere in the trees, cicadas sang their soft summer song. Clara stared into the horizon, then spoke, quietly. "I grew up in a place like this," she said. "Maybe even worse." Brian turned to her gently. "My dad was a mechanic. My mom worked nights in a diner. We didn't have much, and then one day, we had nothing." She paused. "They died in a fire. No headlines, no insurance. Just ashes and a 16-year-old girl with no idea what came next." Brian didn't interrupt. "I clawed my way to community college, got lucky with a mentor, built a business, then watched a partner I trusted gut it from the inside. I lost everything again." Her voice didn't tremble. It didn't need to. The pain was steady, worn like something familiar. "I rebuilt. Stronger, smarter, but colder." She looked at Brian then. "I stopped trusting people. I started thinking that vulnerability was weakness, and love, a distraction." Brian's eyes softened. He didn't rush her. "But then you handed me your phone," she said, almost like a confession. "You didn't ask who I was. You didn't calculate. You just helped." She turned toward him fully. "And since that night, you've been undoing things inside me I didn't even know were locked." He said nothing for a moment. Then, with the same quiet steadiness she once saw in him, he said, "I'm glad, because people believe in you too. Clara, more than you know." For the first time in a long time, her smile wasn't measured. It cracked through her polished exterior, real, full, a little uncertain. "I haven't laughed like this in years," she whispered later that night, after he told a joke that made the kids double over. And in that dusty town with no name on a map, Clara Whitmore, who once built her life on walls and distance, felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a long, long time. Safe. And so, when the leadership program came to a close, and the final night gathered everyone under soft lights and open skies, Clara knew exactly what she wanted to do next. The final evening of the retreat felt like the last page of a book you didn't want to end. The garden behind the Whitmore estate was dressed in strands of soft golden lights, swaying gently in the breeze. Laughter echoed between trees. Someone played quiet jazz from a portable speaker. Glasses clinked. Stories were shared, some personal, some hard-won. Brian stood near the edge of it all, his hands tucked into his pockets, still not quite used to being seen. Noticed. Across the garden, Clara watched him from a distance. He was talking to a group of younger men, offering encouragement the way he always did, gently, without fanfare. He didn't know it yet, but many of them had written his name on their feedback forms under most impactful influence. When the moment felt right, she walked over. "Brian," she said, her voice softer than usual. He turned surprised. "Hey, I was just about to find you." "I beat you to it," she smiled. She nodded toward a bench beneath a flowering tree. "Walk with me?" They sat down side by side in that easy kind of silence only earned through trust. Then she reached into her clutch and pulled out a folded letter. "I was going to give this to you tomorrow," she said, "but I'm not great at waiting." Brian unfolded the letter. Across the top, it read, "Whitmore Foundation, Director of Human Impact Initiatives." He stared at it, then at her. "Director?" Clara nodded. "It's more than a title. It's a voice, a platform, and I trust yours." His hands trembled slightly. "Why me?" Her eyes didn't waver. "Because you lead with heart. Because you remind people what actually matters. And because I believe the world needs more people like you in positions where real change begins." He didn't speak right away. He didn't have to. There was something sacred in the moment. Not flashy, not performative, just true. And yet, Clara wasn't done. She stood, took a few steps away, and turned back toward him, eyes steady, but hesitant in a way that felt new. "There's something else," she said. "Something harder to say." Brian stood too, sensing the shift in her voice. "I've spent most of my life thinking love was either a weakness or a distraction. That if I let someone in, I'd lose focus or control or both." She looked at him, vulnerability etched in every word. "But then I met you, and for the first time, I didn't feel pulled away from myself. I felt grounded, safe." She paused, her voice barely a whisper. "I've had wealth, success, recognition, but I've never had someone who made me feel like I was enough. Until you." Brian took a slow step forward. "I know the age difference matters to some," she added quickly. "The roles we play, the things people might say." But Brian reached for her hand, calm. "Sure, life isn't lived on paper," he said quietly, "and I don't have all the answers. But when I'm near you, I'm not afraid of the future anymore." Clara's breath caught. "I want to walk into that future," he said. "With you?" They stood beneath the lights, two people from different worlds. Not as a mentor and a student, not as a charity and a cause, but as something real. Hope, earned. 2 years later, Brian would stand beneath far brighter lights, at the front of a world stage. But that night, on the flowering tree, was when the real spotlight first found him. 2 years later, Brian stood behind a podium, dressed in a simple dark suit, nothing flashy, just him. The room before him shimmered with possibility. World leaders, humanitarian delegates, hundreds of young changemakers from every continent. The screen behind him displayed images of clean water projects, youth centers, mental health campaigns, programs he had helped launch, people he had helped empower, communities he had quietly uplifted, not with speeches, but with listening, showing up, and staying when it mattered most. He took a breath, stepped forward, and spoke. There was a time, not long ago, when all I had was a cracked phone, a secondhand backpack, and the hope that someday things might get better. The audience leaned in. I wasn't special. I was just surviving. Then, One night at a cold bus stop, a stranger asked to borrow my phone. I could have said no, but I didn't. He paused, and that moment, that quiet yes, became the turning point of my life. In the front row, Clara sat with her hand resting gently over her heart, eyes glistening. She didn't change my life with money. She changed it with belief, with the choice to see me when I didn't even know how to see myself. A hush fell over the room. Sometimes, Brian continued, we think we need to move mountains to make a difference. But the truth is, the world doesn't change all at once. It changes one decision at a time. One small kindness. One open hand. One yes. The room erupted in applause, not thunderous, but deeply felt. And when Brian stepped down from that podium, he didn't stay for the cameras. He didn't linger for interviews. Instead, he found Clara waiting near the exit. She didn't say a word at first. She didn't need to. He took her hand, and together, they left the spotlight behind. That evening, they walked barefoot along a quiet shoreline, far from city, far from noise. The sun melted into the ocean, soft and golden. Waves touched their feet. Their footprints followed behind. Two sets, now side by side. You've come a long way from that bus stop, she said, smiling into the breeze. Brian laughed gently. And you've come a long way from hiding behind glass towers. They walked on, not speaking, because sometimes the silence says everything. That night, there were no stages, no panels, no titles, just two people who had found each other, across time, across distance, across everything the world said didn't make sense, and said yes anyway. Closing reflection, because at the end of the day, it was never about money, power, or prestige. It was about belief. It was about trust. It was about a cracked phone, a stranger's voice, and the quiet power of a single choice made in the cold. And that's how life gets rewritten. Maybe you've never stood at a podium. Maybe your name has never been on a building or in the news. But if you've ever said yes when no one expected you to, if you've ever helped without asking for anything in return, then you already understand the lesson of this story. The biggest changes don't always begin with a plan. Sometimes they begin with a moment of kindness. Brian didn't know who Clara was. Clara didn't know she was still capable of trusting someone. And neither of them expected that one simple act would rewrite both of their lives. Backhand index pointing right. So here's the question. What could your next yes lead to? Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of the quiet strength inside us all, please give it a like, share it with someone who needs it, and leave a comment below. Just one word. How did it make you feel? And if you like more true, powerful, soul-stirring stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Michael Stories, because sometimes all it takes is one story to remind us how beautiful the human heart can be. We'll see you in the next one.